Hey folks, it's Jackie Zoe again. We are talking about phase 2 of the SOC 2 journey to audit. Phase 2 is readiness assessment. And what I'm going to walk you through is everything that you need to prepare and what to expect when it comes to assessing your readiness. So, first things first, remember governance, not quality. Here we're talking about what it is you need to determine whether you have what you need. So, readiness assessment. All right. Here's the agenda. Gap analysis, control mapping, risk identification, evidence framework setup. These are typically the kind of activities that you're going to be doing upon your readiness assessment phase. Gap analysis, we are going to be referencing the AICPA Trust Services Criteria Framework because that's what your auditor is going to be referencing. So that is how we're going to do that gap analysis. It's going to be a structured comparison between what you currently do and what you've chosen to do. Now, you can engage a partner like PolarStar, or you could do this yourself, right? All the information is out there. You don't need to hire somebody if you have the time and the resources to do it. Because really what you're looking for is what controls do you guys have? Is there documentation for those controls? Do you have documentation for controls that don't exist? And what is it that you do in practice, right? And how's that documented? And you want to just do a comparison test across all these things because what your auditors are going to be looking for is it written, is it implemented, and is it operating consistently in the way that you've written it? Yeah. So a very common mistake is that some policy exists because it was created, let's just say, in a vacuum. No one is following it because there's no accountability and there's no evidence that you can provide to even show that it happens because no one's really following it. That is very common, especially for a company that is moving really quickly or is earlier in their maturity phase. So what you can expect for early stage gaps are issues around formal risk assessment documentation. So how are you assessing risk? What does your vendor management process look like? You likely have one, and there are probably common factors in which you're looking at, but it's not documented, and it's not done arguably consistently because there's no documentation, there's no evidence. How often are you doing access reviews? Are you tracking change management? Is that consistent? And do you have incident response testing? So not just a plan, but you're actually testing or you're doing tabletop exercises. So those are typically what we see. Now, once you have a gap sort of assessment in terms of documentation, controls, things of that sort, you'll also want to do a mapping of those controls to the trust services criteria. So again, map the controls you have to the control points that are listed. One thing I want to highlight is that more controls doesn't mean better requirements. You can have a single control mapped to multiple control points within the service criteria. That's possible. What you need to simply be sufficient is clear ownership, repeatable execution, and an evidence trail. The thing with more controls is that it creates more audit surface area. So you want to have the right balance. This is usually where an external partner is helpful in providing a more objective view of things, right? Because when you get really in the weeds, it makes a lot of sense. There's a reason why you have certain controls. And yes, technically that control is to address XYZ, but does that control need to be within scope, right? And is that control part of your system scope? So these are all things that just have to be a bit of a mapping exercise. So here are the common criteria for security. I'm only going to talk about security because that is what is required. There are 9 of them. And I won't go through all of what it means because you can read it here, but understand that this is the purpose of those criteria. And I'll just say that the control environment is really the tone at top in governance. This is about leadership buy-in, leadership involvement. So highlighting that, underscoring that, because it is really important. And what we've seen in the past is if you don't have that, this whole process is really difficult. So take a screenshot of that and get a sense of what you're going to need for each of those. Here's the reality of all of the criteria, and this is what auditors are going to be looking for or wanting. So in the control environment, they just want proof that leadership is formally accountable because as I mentioned a couple slides ago, policy exists, no one follows it, no evidence can be provided that it happened. The no one follows it. That's the key. That's the accountability piece. And I've actually seen this in a few organizations where policies are written, it's been shared, people have been enabled, but no one follows it because there is no formal accountability from leadership. Leadership has to hold people to the policies that exist. So this part is documentation heavy, but if you're doing type 2, they're going to want to check for evidence of things actually happening. For communication and information, they really want to look at completion rates regarding training, risk assessment. A lot of companies fail here because they're just doing a static spreadsheet once a year. Auditors want to know and see that it's a living document and it's actually influencing decisions. Now, again, whether or not it's good or bad, right? You can talk to us to determine that if that quality is something that you are striving for. And if you do strive for it, to be honest, the better off you are. But if you are looking for it to just be a checkbox, that's why the static spreadsheet ends up happening. Monitoring activities, this is where automation can really help. Control activities, this is where sampling becomes really heavy. Logical physical access controls, again, another heavily sampled area because access controls are pretty high risk when it comes to security. System operations, you don't need a breach to prove that you guys are doing anything. You just need proof that you could or would handle one properly if it were to happen. Change management, these are things like GitHub, Jira artifacts, and then of course risk mitigations. Auditors will check that high critical vulns are closed within whatever policy you wrote. If you say those vulns are going to be closed within 2 years, that's your policy, and you're within policy, that is still a-okay from an auditor. Highlighting that because, again, governance, not quality. So here are some tips. The controls must match reality. So if you're saying engineering deployed via GitHub, but your policy says changes are approved via Jira, that's an issue, right? And that doesn't seem like a very big deal. It's not really a security truly problem, but this is where you're going to get a qualified opinion, right? Your engineers deploy via GitHub, but your policy says Jira. There's a mismatch there. And then that implies accountability issues that your leadership, your organization doesn't have their stuff like controlled. And so auditors are testing operational reality, not these aspirational diagrams. They don't care about how good or bad something is, really. If you want good or bad, you reach out to somebody like us or a partner to help you be good. But you don't really need that for a SOC 2 report. Risk identification, this is really the most misunderstood part of SOC 2. So what SOC 2 requires is that the risks connect threat, vulnerability, impact, and control. So what that means or implies is that you need to have a documented risk assessment process so that you can identify those risks, have it somewhere, right? And your controls are mapped to then mitigate them. So a bad sort of statement would be, we risk data breaches. A good statement is, if privileged access reviews are not performed quarterly, terminated employees may retain access to production systems. Now, that is a clear identified risk in which controls can then be mapped directly to. You want to define it at the policy level. You want to define risk appetite, and that's where having leadership involvement is really helpful and important, because that is that tone from the top. Now, that's why a risk register is usually a artifact that auditors are going to ask for, because they want to see, right, that you have these risks identified. And if you identify risks, there is an assumption that there is a risk assessment process. You just have to have it documented. Here are the minimum requirements for a risk register to qualify as a true register. A risk description, likelihood, impact, inherent risk scores, mitigating controls, and residual risk. Now, here's a problem that we've seen happen a lot. You're going to be like, oh, my tool does that. My SaaS tool does that. My DAS, whatever it may be. But our recommendation to you is have a consolidated area for a risk register. It could be an Excel sheet that gets dynamically updated, right? But have it live somewhere. And if it lives in multiple places, document that. Because auditors are going to ask for evidence that these risks are reviewed periodically and evidence that leadership is aware that these risks exist. So you want to define risk tolerances. That will be a key factor. And these risk tolerances will also be very helpful in internal reporting purposes. So what is a risk tolerance? Kind of a side note. A tolerance is just a very specific threshold that you set. Thresholds can always change, but you have to have that threshold in order to report back. Eventually, you can fine tune that threshold to a point that is valuable to the business. But in the beginning, you just have to have one. It may not be the right one, and that's okay. So now we've got evidence framework set up. So controls are easy to have and to document, but the evidence discipline is hard, right? Showing that we are actually doing what we're saying we're doing. That's harder. Here's the basics in setting up your evidence framework. So what I will call out is that even though we're saying evidence for the audit, evidence is really not so much for the audit, even though that is what they're asking for. A better mindset is that it is proof that your controls are operating. These are the things that you actually should be looking at on a regular basis to ensure that you are doing what you're saying you're going to do. Because that is, after all, what trust is all about. The audit simply just tests for it. So what you want to really be answering is our controls were designed and operating effectively. And when you do this well, the evidence can and should be used in enterprise deal cycles as definitive proof that your governance program is defendable. If you do this right, the doors really open up for you when it comes to defending your maturity to companies and enterprises that really care about risk. And it is and can be a competitive advantage, especially if you're in that fintech space and you're dealing with some of those big monsters, like monster companies. Here's what good evidence looks like. Good evidence is time-bound, it's consistent, it's generated by system, meaning there's no manual human error, it's less likely anyway, and it is traceable. Bad evidence are screenshots with no dates, artifacts recreated after the fact. So an example would be a risk register that isn't dynamically updated and is pulled and created after risks start showing up, an email saying, hey, we reviewed it. That's not good. You want it to be trackable. So think of it like if you're using a ticketing system, you just want to have different statuses to help state what's been done when it's been done. And undocumented verbal processes. That's really bad. That's all tribal knowledge stuff. Now, it happens. Again, this is a maturity journey, so it's not to say this is horrible, but it's just to say you're immature, right? And mature companies don't always want to deal with immature companies, so you want to get to a place where you guys can play ball. What you'll want to have ready when it comes to setting up your evidence pipeline is understand where the evidence lives, how often it's collected, what is the naming convention of the evidence, who collects it, and what is the format of it. Now, this isn't anything the auditors really need to know, but when the auditors do ask, you want your team prepared, ready to go, to know exactly where to go get it, because that is what will prolong audit timeline if you don't have the samples ready to go for them. So here's an example of a control, right, of good evidence for CC3 risk assessment, which is the trust service criteria. The control here, let's say, is management performed an annual risk assessment. So your auditors are going to ask you, show me evidence that this control exists and is implemented and is followed. So formal risk register document, meeting minutes showing that the risk was reviewed, a presentation proving that the risk was discussed, a version history showing all the updates, and updated mitigation tracking. That's really strong evidence that answers who reviewed it, when, and what changed. So the key principle, evidence must prove the control operated, not just that it exists. So documentation, a knowledge base is not going to be enough. Another example for the criteria of logical access controls. So let's say your control that you're saying that is mapped to this trust service criteria is access to prod systems is restricted to authorized personnel and reviewed quarterly. Awesome, love it, great, cool, control, that's what you wrote. So just show me that that's what you guys are doing. So strong evidence, user access export from one of your cloud providers. Identity provider export plus MFA is enabled. Quarterly access review spreadsheet, ticket showing removal of terminated employee, and workflow, right, of joiner, mover, leaver, right? Does that all exist? A weak evidence would be a screenshot of the policy. So you're like, all right, cool, it's written, but I don't know, are you actually doing these things? An undated screenshot of user list. So again, bad evidence, there's no time frame. And then an email again saying, hey, we reviewed it. That's all very... that's not strong evidence, and if anything, that will be written as a unqualified or as a qualified opinion, just saying, hey, This is kind of how they're doing things. Now, whether or not that's good or bad, that's really up to your prospect to decide upon reviewing that SOC 2 report. But just know, right, those are the things that they're going to be looking for. So here are just things that are good to know. A single control can be mapped to multiple trust services criteria. So you've got control 1, it could be mapped to multiple, control 2, so on and so forth. It's important to note that more controls does not necessarily mean better, right? You just want to be accurate and provide the necessary information to meet the necessary objective, which is to build or provide the trust that your prospects need in order to work with you. So remember, governance, not quality. Auditors want to know, does your system do what it claims to do? Where are those commitments documented, and can you prove it? It's all about, are you doing what you say that you're doing? And if you have a governance framework, at the very least, you can pinpoint what went wrong and how to fix it. If you don't have that at a bare minimum, you can't even do that. You can't even fix it, right? So that's really what SOC 2 is looking at. Do you have the foundations to be better? So again, reach out to us if you have any questions. I want to learn a little bit more, need some help, right, in this entire process. We do know what it takes. We want to be your partners in security, but we got a few more in the series. Feel free, watch the rest.